What's up, guys? I'm Cooper VanDriessche, back with Wednesday afternoon football, and you know what we're going to be talking about? The College Football Playoff Week 2 rankings. They released last night, and there is a lot to dive into detail about what the committee got right, what they got wrong, and who isn't in the top 25 that should be. All that and more coming up right after this. Thanks again for joining me today, guys, on Wednesday afternoon football. I'm Cooper VanDriessche, and like I said, last night the College Football Playoff released week 2 of their annual rankings, and it was kind of all over the place once again. A little better than we saw last week, because after some games over the weekend, things were solved, things were kind of put into a mindset. But again, there's still lots of football to play, and this ranking matters more than last week, but next week will matter more than this week, and so on until college football conferences come around. And then we know what the true final rankings are going to be. And going into conference weekend, you kind of know, but based on who loses, that kind of changes up some things. So it's going to be really interesting to see as the season goes on. Obviously, the teams there, if they're in the rankings, they want to stay and move up. And obviously, the teams that are just on the outside want to get in there. So let's go over the top 25 to 1 like we did last week, and just kind of see what the committee got right, what they got wrong, and who they missed out on. Because to me, there was one team that was really, I want to say, not given a lot of love by the committee, and they played some pretty good games. So let's dive right in, starting at 25 and going to 21. Coming at 25th, Washington. 24th, Kentucky. 23rd, Florida State. 22, UCF. And 21, Illinois. So starting off with Washington, they started out on a pretty heavy run, and then they kind of just fell off as the season continued to go on. But a great win over the weekend for the Huskies against then-ranked Oregon State. That was a big game for them. The Oregon State fell out of the rankings after that game, so Washington in the top 25. 24, Kentucky. Mark Stoops this season set a record for the winningest all-time coach of Kentucky, beating out the legendary Bear Bryant. So a lot of good things happening. Unfortunately for Kentucky, this is a very tough SEC this year, especially the division they're in. All around, it's not just one team has it given to them. Games have been lost for some teams, hurting them more. But they did have a pretty tough loss early in the season, about 2 weeks ago, to Tennessee. So how they continue to move on through the season is going to be interesting. They should win out for the rest of the games, but again, with the SEC, you never know. It just means more down there. So we'll just have to see how they finish out their season. 23rd, Florida State, huge win over their rival Miami. That's a big game for them. They have another big game coming up in Florida, who's another rivalry game. And when it comes to rivalry games, records to me are thrown out the window. It doesn't matter how bad or good you are, you play differently in a rivalry game. So again, Florida State has a lot to prove still. They're sitting at 6-3 and a weak ACC. So we'll just have to see where the Seminoles finish out their season. UCF is our number 22. Have a huge game this weekend against Tulane. This game, to me, is going to decide who is the top non-Power 5 team going into a New Year's Six bowl bid. Right now, Tulane, as we're going to talk about in a little bit, is just higher up. So it's going to be between UCF and to me, UCF and Tulane. So they're going to be a good game this weekend. And whoever wins that game is going to decide the Power 5 for the rest of the season. And they're both in the American Athletic Conference, so the AAC. I'm pretty strong this year with UCF, Tulane, and then Cincinnati has also always been pretty good in that conference, having a 19-game conference winning streak until they went into Central Florida and lost. And number 21, Illinois, had a tough loss over a pretty bad Michigan State squad. It's going to be interesting to see how Brent Bielema and his team bounce back. After having a pretty awesome season, only suffering one pretty close loss to Indiana, which, again, looking back on, they should have won. But again, it's still early in the season, so it's hard to judge games based on how early in the season it was. So yeah, Illinois still has a lot to prove. They can still be that number 1 team in their Big Ten division, but again, they have to prove themselves first. And there's a lot of football left to play. 3 weeks of regular season plus conference championship weekend has a lot to prove for these teams on the list. Now, let's go into the top 20 and go 20 through 16. Coming in at 20, the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. 19, Kansas State. 18, Texas. 17, Tulane. And 16, NC State. Okay, let's start off with the Fighting Irish. Huge win at home over 4th-ranked Clemson. Totally blew Dabo Swinney and the Tigers out of South Bend after that game. Fans stormed the field after, which was always great to see. And when you think about it, Notre Dame, without those 2 tough losses to Marshall and Stanford, could be in the top 5. Realistically, they just had that close loss to Ohio State to open up their season, and if they were to win those games that they lost in Marshall and Stanford, could be in a top 5 team looking in and getting into the playoffs. So Marcus Freeman in his first year definitely has still got some room to figure out. Play Navy this weekend in an annual game that they'll play every year. But they also finish out their season at USC, which should have some pretty big implications when it comes down to it, because when you think about it, how you end your season is more important than how you start it. So see how the Fighting Irish finish there. Kansas State blew out Oklahoma State 2 weeks ago and then fell to Texas over the weekend. So it's an interesting Big 12. You think one team's going to win it right now, and then they totally fall off. That was the preseason with Baylor, and then for a while it was Kansas. So again, lots of movement around there in the Big 12. But none of these teams we're going to talk about until we get to TCU, who's going to be the top team in the Big 12. Now, number 18, Texas, a ranking I see is a little too high for the Longhorns. They got a pretty big game this weekend to prove themselves against TCU. It's a home game, so you would assume it's going to have some luck on their side. College game day is going to be there. It's going to be pretty exciting. So whoever, that's going to give some more Big 12 implications there for who's going to be playing in the conference championship. 17, Tulane keeps on moving up the rankings. The Green Wave had a great game over the weekend away. This is the non-Power 5 team to beat, and that's just what it comes down to. So if they beat UCF this weekend, I don't really see anyone else in their way on their schedule that could beat them until you get to their conference championship. But again, Tulane is the one in control right now for the non-Power 5 schools. Last year, Cincinnati, and this year it is Tulane. And finally, in this part of the ranking is the 16th ranked team, NC State, beat Wake Forest over the weekend in a pretty weak ACC, especially on the ACC Atlantic is the tougher side of the ACC. But even then, it's not very good teams this year. You look at the ACC right now, and Notre Dame would be the number 1 team in the ACC. They beat North Carolina at North Carolina, and they just destroyed Clemson at home. So the ACC is weak this year, and really you look at it, you don't think the ACC is going to get into the college football playoff for the second year in a row, which with a team like Clemson and Dabo Swinney and the dynasty he's built, is kind of crazy to think about. But NC State with a pretty big win over Wake Forest over the weekend with their dominant quarterback. Now, this is where I want to talk about the team I believe was forgotten. And this is where I think they should be in the top 20 in that 16 through 20 rankings, and that's Liberty. Hugh Freeze went down to Arkansas and kind of put it to him, like, oh, it was a close game. You don't expect an independent school to beat a school in the SEC like that. So, especially for a school like Arkansas, who was pretty heavily ranked going into the season. Liberty is totally forgotten by the committee, and it's kind of unacceptable that teams like Texas and even you would think Washington, that they're not in there. So again, the committee still has a lot to get right, and if Liberty continues to win, I have no doubt they'll be in there somewhere. And I hope it's in the top 20, and they've proven themselves this season. And they play UConn this weekend, another independent team, and they should looking at UConn, they should put it 2 on UConn. Still not very good, but having a pretty good season so far. So it's going to be another good game, but again, I have no doubt that Liberty will win out with their schedule. Now let's go to 15 through 11. That's going to mean 15, North Carolina, the Tar Heels. 14, Penn State. 13, Utah. 12, UCLA. And 11, Ole Miss. North Carolina. Mac Brown got the team on today. Going to change it up per week, so not biased toward any team. But Mac Brown done a great job in his tenure back in North Carolina. Definitely his best season so far back in Chapel Hill. They have to win one more game and they'll clinch that Coastal win and be playing for a conference championship. So they have 3 games left. This week they play Wake Forest, and next week they play Georgia Tech. So again, Tar Heels win one more game and they're playing for conference championship because they will win the tiebreaker when it comes against Duke, because they beat Duke at Duke earlier in the season. 14, Penn State, the Nittany Lions. James Franklin came off a tough loss against Ohio State, and they just got to keep winning. Realistically, they wouldn't play for a conference championship unless some crazy things happen in the Big Ten. I mean, Ohio State almost lost to Northwestern over the weekend, but in 2016, Penn State was kind of that team that was kind of shafted out of it because of how things work with Ohio State. They lost to Ohio State, but they won the Big Ten, but they didn't make it in the college football playoff. So again, it's just going to be how teams finish their season at this point. Moving up to number 13, Utah. The Utes pretty much controlling their destiny in the Pac-12. If things go right for them, they beat USC. So if USC has another conference loss, they're in that Pac-12 championship. So Utah won it last year. Coach Whittingham has been there for a very long time. Replaced Urban Meyer. We talked about that last week before he went down to Florida. And if the Utes are, although not the team people expected them to be this when the season opened up, as they were in the top 10, they've regained some respect, regained some of that respect that a lot of people had for them going into the season. The opening up and losing in Florida in the Swamp was tough for them, but again, they've proven themselves since then. And number 12, UCLA got a pretty big game coming up against USC, which is going to, once again, decide those Pac-12 implications. And Pac-12 is so much better than anyone could have expected this year. I think they maybe haven't won a bowl game in the past 2 years. And for them to be 4 teams, I believe, in the top 15, it's pretty good for a Pac-12 that was pretty weak going into this season on paper. Just big things coming for the Pac-12. And I know they're losing USC and UCLA, but if they can show this dominance with those other teams, I have no doubt that the Pac-12 will be perfectly fine. But again, they have to find that football dominance. And with Oregon State showing, Washington showing, still having Oregon, if a few other teams can just, Utah, a few other teams can just step it up, I mean, that's 4 teams right there. So it just depends on how these other teams can step up in the absence of powerhouse schools like UCLA and USC. And number 11, Ole Miss, Lane Kiffin plays Alabama this weekend. That's some big SEC West implications there as well. LSU beat Alabama in overtime on a 2-point conversion call by Brian Kelly, which we'll talk about a little bit. Gutsy on his part. If Ole Miss beats Alabama, they need LSU to lose one more game because LSU would lose the tiebreaker there. And that's Ole Miss's only loss. And then, that wraps up our 15 through 11. And now going to the top 10, we'll talk about these teams one at a time and go a little bit more into detail for each of them. Coming in at number 10, Clemson, coming off their loss to Notre Dame. So it's hard to grasp what the Tigers are this year. Last year they had another off year. And one of my biggest things that I hate hearing about Clemson is Dabo Swinney is nobody without a generational quarterback. That is everything college football. You're not a team without a generational talent. How do you think Alabama has been so good over the years? How do you think Georgia's starting to get better? It's all about talent. For me, it's personally like 90% recruiting and 10% actually coaching. If you can put the talent together, that's what you need to do. But all of it comes down to recruiting. And of course, when you have a good quarterback, you're going to win. And it's not just that fact. Dabo Swinney's been very successful at Clemson. He took a team over that was struggling, that was grasping at the ACC, and has been very successful. They clinched their Atlantic part of the ACC and will be playing for a conference championship again after missing it last year. So how Dabo Swinney finishes, I think they went out, and they're on paper right now, their toughest test would be UNC, assuming they make the conference championship. And Notre Dame beat by Clemson more than they did UNC. Granted, UNC was at, it's kind of hard to grasp, but you'd assume that UNC actually has the advantage going into that game. But again, the Clemson still has a lot to prove, and right now you don't think that they'll make the playoff, and everything, a lot would have to go right for them to be in that spot in the playoff in January. And coming in at number 9, the Crimson Tide from Tuscaloosa, Nick Saban's Alabama squad suffered that really tough loss to LSU in Death Valley over the weekend. And people are like, oh, Nick Saban's era is ending. Oh, that's a bunch of baloney. Nick Saban has won more national championships than people can count. And to hear, oh, well, he hasn't lost 2 games before Thanksgiving since 2010. He won 5 national championships in the time since then. So I think Nick Saban will be just fine. No one's stopping going to Alabama because they might finish 10-2. I mean, no one's going to stop them from that. So Alabama's fine, and I think people need to calm down a little bit. Nick Saban will be okay. He will finish out all right. Nick Saban knows how to coach. And people question, oh, he's getting older up in age. Yeah, but some people know how to coach. And when you're one of those generational talents and coaches, you'll be just fine. You know how to handle some adversity. Coming in at number 8, the Trojans from Southern Cal. SC looks like they should win out the next 2. They win out their conference games, and they have one final home test against Notre Dame. So assuming how that game goes, they could finish in the top 10. But again, Notre Dame is one of those teams that have upset teams. So you just have to see how Lincoln Riley's done a great job in his first year. More than people would have expected for a team that struggled last year and didn't make a bowl game. So, I mean, people say like these generational teams that have been good for so long, when they're better, college football is better, and I totally agree with that statement. When these teams that have been powerhouse for so long are better, it just makes the sport so much more exciting. So again, how they finish out is going to be a little interesting just based on how everywhere the Pac-12 has been. And they've had some close wins, but again, it's all about wins. It's not about, as you get into later seasons, about style points. Right now, you're just gonna make sure you have those win counts in the win column. I mean, at number 7, LSU, huge win. We just talked about it over Alabama over the weekend, and Brian Kelly made a pretty gutsy call going for 2. But I mean, you think about it, your team's getting tired. You know how much longer you can stay sick with a team like Alabama, and you win. And you think about it, and you think, I don't think anyone would have thought that Brian Kelly would have been this successful in year 1. You look back at his early season loss to Florida State, you wonder how that happened. And then you think about his stomping by Tennessee, based on what we're going to talk about. Tennessee played was kind of surprising, but Brian Kelly's been pretty successful so far, and the only thing Brian Kelly has to worry about is wearing out his welcome. But right now, people in Baton Rouge, as long as you're winning, they don't care about that. So, and right now, they're controlling their spot to play in for their division in the SEC and the SEC championship game. At number 6, Oregon. The Ducks have been pretty good coming off that loss against Georgia to open their season, and I think, based on what the committee said, they have given it more to teams based upon how they've won recently. Like the win against their loss to Georgia is more favorable than Tennessee's loss to Georgia. So that could help the Ducks get in there, assuming things go right for them. I mean, someone's going to lose the Michigan-Ohio State game, 2 teams we haven't talked about yet because they're higher up in our rankings. And then if TCU has one of the toughest remaining schedules left in the country. So, got to fix the lights here. We're not done talking. 1 sec. Okay, we're good now. We're good. But again, TCU has one of the toughest ranked schedules left. So if anything goes right, the Ducks could be in there. So just gotta see how that goes. And then at number 5, Tennessee fell from number 1 after that really tough loss to Georgia over the weekend at Sanford Stadium. The final result, 27-13, is not as close as it looked. Georgia dominated that game, start to finish. And Tennessee has to hope some things go well. I mean, right now, looking at it, someone's going to lose the Michigan-Ohio State game, like I just said, and TCU has to win out. So they could be back in it. They just got to be careful. Again, only one number 1 ranked team in the first rankings hasn't made it into the college football playoff, but they're kind of in the same boat as Oregon. So we got to see how the Vols finish after having that number 1 ranking for a little bit of a short time. And here come your top 4. The top 4 teams that are right now are projected to make the college football playoff at the end of December and in January. At number 4, TCU, the Horned Frogs. Sonny Dykes, in his first year at the helm of the program, has done a pretty good job based on what team he took over. 3-9, I believe, last year. And I don't think anyone, like we said for LSU and Brian Kelly, no one would have thought that TCU would be in the talk of making the college football playoff this year. So they got to finish out. They got a big game against Texas this weekend, and then the rest of their schedule was equally as difficult. So if they win out, there's no doubt, and win the Big 12, then they're in. That's what they have to do. Oh yeah, super easy, but not as easy as it's a lot easier to say than it is to do. So keep your eye on the Horned Frogs. They're kind of asleep right now. I don't think anyone can do it. Just keep your eye on the TCU Horned Frogs. Number 3, Michigan, moving up from number 5, rightfully so. Had a little bit of a scare in the first half against Rutgers, but put it to them in the second half. So it's going to be a good game against Michigan-Ohio State. Closer based on how Ohio State played over the weekend. I think it's going to be a lot closer than it might even be flipped, because a lot of people think Ohio State's going to win right now, but keep an eye out for Michigan. They might win this game. They might win that game. And then number 2, Ohio State, the Buckeyes, had some pretty big games over the season, and they struggled against a 1-7 Northwestern team, which is a lot of people were questioning Ohio State's ability to play big games. But let's take in account the winds at Ryan Field were 50 miles an hour. That is not easy to play in either way. I think the only reason that Northwestern played so well was it was a home game. Playing on a home field was a lot easier to play on, you would imagine. So again, I think that's the only reason really Ohio State struggled, and they just got to make sure I have no doubt they'll win out the rest of their games before the Michigan game. And lastly, the number 1 team in the nation, to no surprise, the Bulldogs from the University of Georgia. Put it to the number 1 team in the nation over the weekend. And you think, once again, is this a new dynasty? Is Kirby Smart the new Nick Saban? And he very well could be. He was a long-time assistant under Nick Saban, and obviously he took some knowledge. It didn't take him very long. It only took about 5 years for him to win a national championship, which in college football, you look at, oh, it's so long, but really that's not long of a time considering how long some coaches have been in college football. It's pretty amazing what Kirby Smart has done there in the short period of time he's been there. So, does Georgia win out? That's what I believe. I would have to think so. I think a lot of things have to go wrong for the Bulldogs. I mean, yes, they played Kent State close and almost lost to Missouri, but you never know. They just hand it to the number 1 team in the nation, and on a neutral site, what happens? We'll have to see if that's what's in favor for the college football playoff. So that wraps up the rankings of the top 25, and I want to talk about one more thing about LSU. LSU, let's say they win the SEC. It's going to be pretty tough for them to hop into the top 4. I'm not saying it's impossible. LSU is the only 2-loss team to ever win a national championship, so it might be the very first 2-loss team making the college football playoff in the 4-team ranking. So we'll just have to see. It's going to be interesting. Committee's got a lot on their hands. It's not an easy decision on either side, and it's just so fun to watch as a college football fan, someone that's analyzes college football, to see all these ups and downs, these changes, because it's what makes the sport. It's what makes it different than pro football, because you can talk about it like this. There's not a ranking system like this in the pros. You don't wait every week on Tuesday night to see them come out on ESPN. This is what makes college football special, and this is what makes the college football season so special on top of that. And it's one of the best times of the year. It's when you can see some true fan pride come out, see those colors bleed, red and black or blue and gold. Whatever you bleed, it's one of the best time of year to watch college football. And there's nothing like starting college football with the college football game day on Saturday. Well, that wraps it up for me on Wednesday afternoon football. I really enjoyed talking about it. We talked about this for 2 weeks in a row. We'll talk about it next Wednesday again, because who knows what's going to change over a weekend. Lots of games happened over the weekend, and so much is going to change. And this ranking is not the ranking we're going to see in 4 weeks when the final rankings come out. That is it for me. I'm Cooper VanDriessche on Wednesday afternoon football, and I will see you guys next week.